On a snowy mountain trail, a black woman and her 11-year-old son heard a faint cry. They found a little girl lost in the cold, her father stranded farther up the path. Braving the worsening weather, they helped them reach safety. Months later, when the woman was wrongfully accused, that father and daughter would be the ones to step forward and defend her. Before we begin, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Help! The cry was thin and high, more breath than sound. A ribbon of fear tugged loose in the trees. Emily froze before the second call cut sharper, a quick blade through the muffled hush of flurrying snow. She and her son had just left the weekend fair, she with the ache that always followed a good day's sales, he with that leftover sparkle from talking to grown-ups about water filters and headlamps, and were rolling the last crate toward the open hatch of her battered Subaru when the wind shifted and carried the voice down the slope. "Did you hear that?" Ben whispered, already lowering his knit cap and angling his body toward the break in the pines. Emily's hand tightened on the crate handle, a reflex older than her business license or the stenciled logo on the shop apron under her parka. The part of her that knew mountain weather, how it lied, how it turned an hour into a hazard, answered before her mouth did. She clicked the hatch shut, tucked the keys into a pocket she could reach with gloves on, and said, "Take the headlamp, go slow, follow my steps." This was their life. A small outdoor shop in a town that saw them first as mother and son, and only then maybe, as owners and helpers, weekends loading tents and stoves and boxes of wool socks into a car that coughed in the cold evenings, counting cash with chapped fingers and telling each other one good thing that happened that day. Today's good thing had been a steady stream of customers and a kid who'd saved his allowance to buy a compass. Now the good thing was a voice they could not pretend not to hear. They slid off the shoulder of the forest road and into knee-deep powder, the trees draped in a fresh hush that ate their footfalls. Ben moved the way she'd taught him, wait low, test the crust, commit, his small shoulders squared with the seriousness he wore when the world called him to be bigger than 11. The cry came again, closer, and then the shape of a little girl appeared where the trail curled around a boulder, coat askew, one mitten clutched against her mouth as if tears needed a lid, snow dusting her braids. "Hey there," Emily said, crouching to the girl's eye level so the wind wouldn't steal the gentleness from her voice. "I'm Emily, this is Ben. Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head, shivering. "Grace," she hiccuped. "Daddy slipped. He told me to wait by the stump, but the snow started and I got scared and I ran." The apology in her tone was older than 6. Emily felt the familiar prickle at the back of her neck, not fear exactly, but the sense of a clock starting. Cold bites fast when panic opens the door. She zipped Grace's coat higher, took her mittened hand and said, "We're going to find him. Ben, you go ahead where the trail narrows. I'll be right behind you." As they climbed, the snow thickened from flirtation to intent, blowing sideways in a way that erased landmarks and made the woods look like a painter had smudged the world. They found the man 10 minutes later where the path canted toward a ravine, his back propped against a spruce, 1 foot half buried, the set of his jaw saying, "Do not see me like this." His coat was the kind that promised boardrooms more than trailheads, his boots polished, the wool around his collar already beading with damp. Relief flashed across his face when Grace cried, "Daddy," and then something shuddered it. Pride, surprise, the quick inventory some people did when help did not arrive in a body they'd expected. "I'm all right," he said, and the attempt to stand proved him wrong, his weight slipping on a glassy patch and sending a jolt through his ankle that stole his breath. Emily stepped in and offered her arm without commentary. He hesitated a half-second, the microbeat where a person decides whether to accept a version of themselves that needs someone else, and then grasped her forearm. "Easy," she said, making her voice the calm he could lean on. "We'll take it slow. Ben, give Grace your back for the icy stretch." Ben crouched with practiced economy, and Grace folded herself onto him, small arms linked at his chest like she'd trained for this. "The man, Daniel," he said when she asked, 40 by the look of him, and carrying that expensive stillness people buy with money, let Emily set their pace. She felt the way he fought the urge to lead, to argue with the terrain, to pretend the pain in his ankle was a rumor. Pride met gravity, and gravity won every time. Emily didn't gloat. She had met humility in hard places and knew not to talk over it. At the trailhead, a pickup idled, heat blooming from the open cab. A man in a thick parka jogged forward, hands out. "Lucky there was someone nearby," he said, and his smile hooked sideways, a too bright joke aimed where it would bruise without leaving a mark. Not often you see a black woman up here in this weather. The sentence pretended to be weather talk, the way some people manage to tuck a verdict inside a compliment. Emily kept her face neutral, shifting her stance to steady Daniel as he stepped over a buried root. She had a catalog for these moments, the soft barbs dressed in local color, the raised brows that asked who let you into our season, the assumption that competence lived elsewhere. Every time, she did the math. Is this the time I spend my breath? The wind needled her cheeks. Ben's shoulders were still under Grace's weight. Daniel's silence opened beside her like a door someone refused to walk through. He did not correct the man or offer a simple, "She knows these trails." He looked at the falling snow. Emily adjusted her grip and said nothing. Grace slid from Ben's back and pressed herself against Daniel's side, her small face blotchy from cold and tears but safe. Emily watched the way Daniel's hand tightened on his daughter's shoulder, the way he swallowed whatever apology he did not have words for. She settled him into the warm cab, helped Grace in after him, and stepped back as red taillights bled into the white. The pickup pulled away, swallowing the moment with it, and the woods returned to the clean quiet that followed, storms and statements no one owned. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that the point was the girl warm in a cab, and the father who would limp less by morning. But the words stuck in her throat like snow turned to ice. There was a cost to being the one who knew what to do, and hearing the surprise that you did, a cost to being competent in a body some people did not expect to carry competence, a cost to watching a man you had steadied find safety in not seeing you fully. Ben came to stand beside her, his breath a pale cloud. "You okay, Ma?" he asked in the careful voice he used when he knew the answer was complicated. She tucked a stray curl under his cap and lied kindly. "I'm fine, we did good." He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the place where the truck had been, a narrow squint that said he had noticed the silence too, and tucked it away in whatever small vaults boys keep for lessons they do not yet have language for. They walked back to the Subaru, the sky thickening to early dusk, the fairground lights blinking out one by one behind them. Emily loaded the last crate with hands that still remembered the weight of Daniel's forearm, and the exact angle his pride had bent. She thought of the customers who'd laughed with her that afternoon, of the couple who'd asked for advice and then returned to say the stove lit on the first try, of the old climber who'd tapped the counter and said, "You run a tight ship." The town held both types, and on most days the balance favored decent. The trick was not to let the other moments calcify. She turned the key, coaxed the engine into life, and let the heater cough warm air onto their hands. Snow feathered the windshield. "Hot chocolate?" she asked, aiming for light. Ben smiled without looking away from the trees. "Extra marshmallows," he bargained, and she said deal, because small rituals could be a shelter too. As they pulled onto the road, the wind shouldered the car with the kind of warning the mountains gave to anyone who pretended they were in charge. Emily tightened her grip on the wheel and felt something in her settle, a quiet vow that had nothing to do with weather reports. She would keep showing up. She would keep being the woman who knew what to do when the world went white. And if the next time the wrong kind of comment rolled off a stranger's tongue and the nearest man chose to study the snow, she would still be there, hands steady, voice even, a warmth stubborn enough to hold in a storm. 3 days later, the snow had eased into a brittle crust that crackled underfoot, and the air carried that sharp, clean edge winter gets when the sun decides to shine. Emily was arranging a display of thermal gloves near the counter when the bell over the shop door jingled. Grace slipped inside first, cheeks pink from the cold, a small knit scarf clutched in her hands. Daniel followed, tall enough to make the shop feel smaller, his coat the kind that cost more than her monthly rent. He nodded, a polite gesture, restrained. "We came to say thank you," he said, glancing toward Grace. The little girl smiled shyly before drifting to the shelves of children's gear. Daniel set a small bag on the counter, "Items for Grace," he explained, to make her next hike more comfortable. Emily wrapped the purchases neatly, her fingers working while she noticed how his gaze moved around the shop, over the worn pine floors, the shelves stocked with both high-end backpacks and modest camping stoves. His eyes lingered on a framed photo of her and Ben from last summer's community trail cleanup, the edges of his expression unreadable. Before she could speak, the door swung open again, bringing in a gust of wind and a man in his late 50s with a face weathered from years outdoors. He stomped snow from his boots and strode to the counter, giving Emily a glance that skimmed past her like she was part of the furniture. "This place sells climbing gear?" he asked, his voice riding the line between joking and sharp. "I figured you folks just sold the cheap stuff." The words landed lightly, as if tossed without thought, but the undertone was clear enough. It was the kind of dismissal she'd heard all her life, a question wrapped in condescension. Emily felt heat rise in her chest, but kept her tone even, her hands steady as she folded a pair of gloves. "We carry gear for every kind of hiker," she said, "including the kind that lasts through more than one winter." She met his gaze just long enough to let the words settle before she turned back to the bag. From the corner of her eye, she saw Ben freeze mid-motion as he stocked water bottles. His gaze moved from the man to her, searching for a crack in her composure. She gave him none. But she felt the weight of his attention shift to Daniel, as if silently asking, "Will you say something?" Daniel had heard it, she could tell by the slight shift of his shoulders, but he only offered the man a quick, almost apologetic smile, followed by a low, neutral chuckle. The kind people use to keep the air light when they don't want to get involved. Then he called Grace over, showing her a compass he'd picked out, as though nothing else had been said. It was a small thing, almost nothing in the span of a day, but the absence of his voice settled in her chest like a draft under a closed door. She hadn't expected him to owe her anything beyond thanks for that day on the trail. And yet she'd hoped just a little that he might recognize how moments like these built up, how they wore a person down more than a single storm. She slid the bag of gear across the counter with a polite nod, signaling that the transaction, both kinds, was over. Grace waved from the doorway, bright and untroubled, and Emily waved back. Ben stayed close to her side, his eyes fixed on Daniel, narrowing not in dislike, but with the kind of guarded awareness kids develop when they sense something isn't right. Emily didn't comment, but she noticed. 2 days later, Daniel returned alone. The snow was falling lightly again, softening the edges of the road outside. He stepped in with purpose, asking about a replacement part for his tent poles and whether there was a safer route up to the ridge for early spring. Emily traced a route on the map spread across the counter, pointing to where the ice lingered longest, where the wind cut hardest. He listened, nodding, typing quick notes into his phone. He never mentioned the awkwardness from the other day, never acknowledged what she'd seen in his silence. The distance was still there, polite, cool, intact. When he left, the bell over the door jingled, and the shop felt quieter than it had all morning. Emily stood for a moment with her hands resting on the map, the weight of unsaid things pressing against her palms. Some storms didn't break in a single day. Outside, Daniel paused before getting into his SUV, glancing back through the frosted glass. Inside, Ben was stacking boxes, his hands busy but his eyes tracking the man until he drove away. It was just a flicker, but Emily caught it. A silent agreement between mother and son that they were paying attention, even when others weren't. The wind was already sharpening by the time Emily locked the shop that afternoon, the kind of dry, stinging gust that scraped across exposed skin like sandpaper. The forecast had promised nothing more than flurries, but the mountains had a habit of turning small warnings into real trouble. She had barely slid into the warmth of her truck when her phone buzzed, an alert from the local rescue network. School field trip stranded on the ridge, snow moving in fast. She didn't have to read the roster to know. Grace was up there. By the time she reached the rescue center, the air was thick with urgency. Volunteers moved like clockwork, hauling ropes, first aid kits, and insulated blankets. Radios crackled with coordinates. The place smelled of damp wool, wet leather, and cold metal. Emily had just shouldered her pack when she spotted him. Daniel standing at the map table, jaw set, voice low and clipped as he spoke with the coordinator. When he looked up, the usual polite distance in his eyes was gone. What replaced it was raw, unguarded concern. "She's in the group," he said, as though Emily didn't already know. The plan was simple, Daniel with the West Trail team, Emily with the North. But the West team was short a person, and when assignments were shuffled, their names landed side by side. Neither argued. This wasn't the time for pride. They stepped into the storm just as the snow began to thicken into heavy wet flakes that clung to eyelashes and filled every crease in their clothing. Emily took the lead, boots crunching over ice-hidden roots, her headlamp casting a pale tunnel of light through the swirling dark. Daniel stayed close, his breath fogging in short bursts. Words were useless against the howl of the wind, but Emily read the rhythm of his steps, steady, deliberate, determined. 30 minutes in, The trail narrowed along a steep slope where drifts had swallowed the path to knee-deep. Emily moved ahead, testing each foothold, calling back for him to follow in her tracks. She had just rounded a bend when she heard it. A quick skid, the hollow thump of a body hitting hard snow. She spun, heart kicking. Daniel was half on his side, one arm out for balance, his face tight with pain. She was at his side in seconds, kneeling in the drift. Ankle, he ground out. She stripped off a glove, pressing lightly at the joint, until she felt the swelling beginning to rise. Not broken, but bad enough. You can walk, a sharp nod. Then we move. She ducked under his arm, taking part of his weight without ceremony. The storm closed around them, turning the world into a white tunnel where time thinned and steps were counted in breath and the scrape of boots. Then, faint under the roar, came high-pitched voices, thin but alive. Emily pushed harder, Daniel matching her pace despite the limp, until shadowed shapes took form. 5 children huddled close, their teacher pale, hands trembling against the cold. Grace's eyes lit wide when she saw them. She stumbled forward, burying herself in her father's arms. He held her like he meant never to let go, but even from where Emily stood, the relief in him was palpable. They moved fast. Emily counted heads, checked for frostbite, organized the order of descent. Ben, already with her team, stepped up when she told him to take Grace. Without hesitation, he crouched low, letting her climb onto his back, adjusting the straps of her pack so it wouldn't slide. "Hold on," he told her, his voice calm and sure, the kind of steady that made Emily's chest ache with pride. One boy lagged behind, his legs locking with cold. Daniel didn't pause. "Come here, buddy," he said, lowering himself enough to scoop the child into his arms. His jaw tightened with each step, but he didn't set the boy down until the trail widened and leveled, long after the worst of the descent. The lights of the rescue center finally flickered through the storm, a warm promise in the dark. Inside, the heat hit them in a wave, the air loud with voices, boots thudding, and the rustle of blankets being wrapped around shivering shoulders. Emily shrugged off her pack, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. When she looked up, Daniel was watching her, not with guarded politeness, not with the cool reserve she'd grown used to, but with something clear and unshaken. "Respect. Thank you," he said, his voice low but certain. This time, Emily believed him. The snow from the storm had long since sunk into gray slush along the roadside when the trouble began. It had been a week since the rescue, enough time for the urgency of that night to fade into a neat story for others, but for Emily, the memory was still raw when her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor. "Have you seen this?" She tapped the link, and grainy, shaky footage filled her screen. Someone's cell phone video from the blizzard. In the whiteout haze, she could just make out her own figure moving toward a cluster of children. The caption burned into her eyes: "Local rescuer prioritizes her own child in school trip emergency. Other children left waiting." Her pulse quickened. She watched again. The edit made it look like she had gone straight to Ben, ignoring the others, her movements slowed and framed with ominous music. The truth that Ben had been closest when she reached the group, that she had followed the rescue plan exactly, was buried under angles and pauses designed to tell another story. Her stomach tightened into a knot hard enough to hurt. By afternoon, the consequences were already circling. An email from the outfitter who had placed a large seasonal order: "We'll have to cancel for now, given recent concerns." A voicemail from the regional outdoor fair committee: "We've decided to go in a different direction this year." And maybe worst of all, the shift on the street, people who once stopped to chat in her shop window now crossing to the other side without looking in, their eyes fixed on the pavement. When Ben came in from school, his cheeks were flushed from the cold, but his eyes carried a different heat. "I heard kids talking about you," he said, his voice shaking between anger and confusion. "They said you only cared about me." "That's not true." "Why would they say that?" Emily knelt so she could meet his gaze, brushing the damp from his hair. "Because sometimes, people believe what's easiest, not what's right," she said softly. He clenched his fists, his small knuckles whitening, but his shoulders sank. What good was the truth when the lie was louder? Across town, Daniel sat at his desk, the same video playing on his laptop. He had watched it twice, and now a third time, his focus settling on the gaps, the moments cut away, the unnatural rhythm of the edits. Still the seed of doubt had taken root. He remembered the storm's roar, the blur of bodies, the chaos. Could it be possible He closed the screen, telling himself it wasn't his place to judge. That evening, as he tucked Grace into bed, she tilted her head. "Daddy, is it true? Did Miss Emily do something wrong?" Her voice was small but steady, braced for an answer she might not want. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her blanket. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said carefully. "And sometimes people see things differently." It was a safe answer, too safe. Grace studied him, her brows pulling tight in a way that reminded him of her mother when she was unconvinced. Daniel kissed her forehead and left the room, but the question trailed him down the hallway, pressing against the part of him that still remembered Emily's face in the storm, focused, unflinching, not the kind of expression you fake. Still the video lodged in his thoughts like a stone in his shoe, small, irritating, impossible to ignore. Ben, meanwhile, carried his anger to school. In the hallway, he overheard the rumors tossed like casual snowballs, kids repeating the captions as though they were fact. He wanted to shout them down, to tell them what really happened, but what proof did he have? All he could do was watch his mother keep her chin up while the air around her seemed to cool, people leaning away as if she carried something contagious. At the shop, the silence was its own kind of weather. The bell over the door hardly stirred all day. Emily worked in the back, mending straps on an old pack, her hands moving automatically, her mind circling the empty hours. She had weathered hard seasons before, tight finances, slow winters, but this was different. This was not the cold of ice or wind, this was the cold of people turning away. And somewhere inside that quiet, Daniel stayed away too. No visits, no calls, just absence. An absence heavy enough to say more than any words could. Grace was unusually quiet over breakfast, pushing small pieces of toast across her plate, while Daniel scanned headlines on his phone. The steady clink of her spoon against the plate finally made him look up. "Daddy," she began, hesitant but steady, "one of my friends said her dad has the whole video from the snowstorm. He was there. He filmed everything. He said Miss Emily was helping all the kids, not just me." Her eyes lifted to his, carrying an urgency that didn't fit her small frame. "Can we get it?" Daniel set the phone down slowly. "Grace," he started, but she leaned forward, her voice gaining speed. "Ben and I could ask her, we could find out if she still has it." The her was the friend's mother, a woman Daniel barely knew. Before he could shape an answer, Grace was already sliding off her chair, calling to Ben in the hall. Daniel heard the sound of boots being laced. His gut tightened. He recognized that tone in Grace's voice, the one that meant she had already decided. By the time he caught up with them, they were halfway down the block, Grace's mittened hand hooked around Ben's wrist. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" His voice cut through the cold air sharper than he meant. Grace stopped, startled, but Ben shifted subtly in front of her, his voice tight. "We're going to ask for the video. People need to see the truth, the truth." The word landed heavier than Daniel expected. He wanted to send them home, to close this off, but instead he heard himself ask, "Do you even know if it exists?" Grace nodded quickly. "He said his dad didn't post it because no one asked, but it's all there." Her breath rose in small white clouds. Something in her conviction stopped him. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll come with you." The friend's house was modest, warm light spilling from the windows into the fading day. Inside, the father led them to a small office cluttered with books, maps and camera gear. Without much preamble, he pulled up the file. The footage opened on chaos, snow whipping sideways, voices shouting through the white. Then Emily appeared, her body bent into the wind, pulling one child toward safety, then another. She moved with precision, scanning the drift for movement, her voice calm even when urgency hummed in the air. Ben came last, simply because he was farther down the slope. The order was pure circumstance, not choice. Daniel leaned closer, watching it twice. There were no cuts, no music, no insinuations, just a woman doing her job, protecting every child she could reach. His jaw tightened, not with doubt this time, but with shame. He had let silence speak for him when he should have spoken. "Can I get a copy?" he asked quietly. The man nodded, transferring the file to a drive. Back home, Daniel sat at his desk long after the kids had drifted to the kitchen for cocoa. The cursor blinked on his email, the file already attached, addressed to the local news. His finger hovered over the mouse. The chime of an incoming call broke the moment. It was Victor Haynes, one of his board members. "Daniel," Victor's voice carried its usual polished calm, but there was a warning underneath. "I hear you're thinking about stepping into that rescue controversy. If you release anything, you'll pull the company into a mess we don't need. Investors are already skittish." Daniel was silent for a beat. "So you think letting a lie stand is better?" "I think protecting the image of the CEO is better," Victor said. The word CEO sat heavy between them, the unspoken reminder that Daniel's position, and the influence it carried, was exactly what made this dangerous. When the call ended, Daniel stayed in the dim light of his office. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals, settling quietly over the street. His own reflection stared back at him from the window. A man with every reason to look away, and every tool to make a difference. He thought of Grace's question, of Ben stepping in front of her without hesitation, of Emily in the storm, steady and unshaken when everyone else faltered. He clicked send. The file left his outbox, small in size, but weighted with consequence. And for the first time in weeks, the quiet around him didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like resolve. Whatever storm came next, he would meet it head-on. The morning the full video went live, Emily was restocking the shelves behind the counter when the door to her shop swung open. The bell jingled, and Daniel stepped in with Grace at his side. There was no hesitation this time, no careful distance in his voice. He walked straight to the counter, removed his gloves, and met her eyes. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but edged with something softer, "I owe you an apology, not the kind you say because it's expected, but the kind that admits you were wrong in every way that mattered." Grace's small hand slipped into Emily's as if to seal the words. He explained that his company was launching a survival skills program for local schools, fully funded, and that he wanted her to lead it. "You've proven you know how to prepare people for what the wilderness can throw at them," he said. "And you've shown me more about leadership than I've learned in years." Emily studied his face for a moment, before nodding once. "If it's for the kids, I'm in," she replied. 2 weeks later, the town hall was packed for the launch event. Snow crunched under boots outside, but inside, the air buzzed with conversation and the scent of fresh pine from the winter decorations. Daniel stood at the podium, the company banner behind him. When he introduced Emily, he didn't just list her qualifications, he told the story of the storm, of the day on the trail, of the moments when she chose action over hesitation. "I stood by in silence once," he said, glancing at the crowd, "but I won't make that mistake again. This community owes her more than we can measure." Applause swelled, and Emily stepped forward, her voice clear as she spoke about the program and her hope for the next generation to meet the wilderness with skill and respect. Near the back, a man in a worn leather jacket shifted awkwardly. It was the same customer who had once sneered at her store, questioning whether she sold real gear. When the crowd began to disperse, he approached with an uneasy smile. "My son's going on a school trip," he said. "Thought maybe you could help us pick the right pack." Emily's hands moved confidently over the shelves, explaining weight distribution and weatherproofing as if nothing had ever passed between them. Outside, the late afternoon sun glinted on the snow, and the street seemed quieter, as though the town itself had taken a deep breath. Daniel watched Emily with the customer, Grace tugging gently at his sleeve. "See," she whispered. "Told you she was the real deal." Daniel smiled, not the polite one he had worn for years, but the kind that came from a place finally cleared of doubt. The circle had closed, but something told him it was also just the beginning.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.